Chairman, thank you. Friends and colleagues, it's a great privilege to address this conference on a subject crucial to our generation and to the peace and security of our world. Trust and dialogue between the great faiths of the world is absolutely essential, as Professor Hans Kung prophetically stated in what is now the previous millennium, not just the previous century. No survival without a world ethic, no world peace without peace between the religions. And the decades since Professor Kung have proved his voice to be prophetic. We are much indebted to our host, the Institute for Cultural Diplomacy, for enabling this conference to make a contribution to that work. It is from grains of sand that beaches are made. Let me just introduce myself very rapidly so there's some sense of where I'm coming from. My current responsibility is Dean of Winchester in the United Kingdom. That means I'm head of foundation of Winchester Cathedral. And there is Winchester Cathedral, a bit like a ship riding at anchor. Winchester was the capital of the Saxon kingdom of Wessex, from which England was first united under a king called Athelstan. It was therefore capital of England before London. The Saxon Minster was replaced by the present cathedral by order of William the Conqueror and celebrated its 900th anniversary in 1993. Slide 2, perhaps. Winchester Cathedral is something of a regional and national icon. It even has a pop song named after it, and some may have heard of Winchester Cathedral. As an icon, I mean that it does rise above denominationalism, above sectarianism, and even secularism, to be a source of inspiration to people regardless of where they are on their spiritual journey. I think one of the jobs of a Dean of Winchester is all the time to realize that you are managing not simply a Christian place of worship, but also a sort of spiritual icon which can communicate to all sorts of people across the nation and to visitors who come in large numbers from overseas. And recently we had the deputy chairman of the Chinese People's Assembly, for instance. And because Jane Austen is buried there, a lot of people come on a literary pilgrimage. So very, very different reasons for coming to the cathedral. Winchester Cathedral does make its contribution to the world's great religious landmarks as a Christian building. It has a beautiful Romanesque font, slide 3, where Christian discipleship begins. It has an exquisite 12th century illuminated Bible, slide 4, to which I shall return in a minute, which, as well as being a version of the foundation Christian text, is also a world treasure. It has a beautifully carved 15th century great screen behind the high altar, slide 5, studied with the saints who are examples of the Christian journey. But all of these treasures are witnesses to the human spiritual quest in its broadest sense. They witness to beauty, creativity, the human aspiration to reach out on a spiritual journey. There is something here to enable the pilgrim to resonate to the deepest yearnings of the human soul, whatever their own religious identity or human story. That, in many ways, is captured by a figure in the Romanesque crypt of the cathedral, sculptured by the British artist Anthony Gormley, slide 6. It often stands well above its ankles in water and simply reflects within a stunning environment. One human being reflecting on where humanity is. The water in which the statue stands is a result of the cathedral being built over a well located directly under the high altar. It could not proclaim more eloquently the faith in God, the creator and source of all, upon which is the premise, the basis, the origin of all religious faiths. And my own contribution today is really to go from the crypt of the cathedral to share some thoughts on a subject which has been lamentably undervalued by the Christian churches of the West, that is being pressed upon us by the current environmental crisis. It is creation theology, and my thesis is straightforwardly this: creation theology as the essential basis of interfaith dialogue and mutual respect. If it is true that creation theology is the essential basis of interfaith dialogue and mutual respect, then the first step is to go more deeply into each one's tradition in order to grow in respect for the traditions of others. In my case, it is to go more deeply into the Judeo-Christian tradition and try to understand its witness to God as creator. And in these brief reflections, I can do no more than seek your indulgence to allow me to share with you where that journey is leading me. An outstanding aspect of the witness of the creation traditions of the Hebrew Scriptures, often identified by Christians as the Old Testament, is their genuine universalism. This comes as something of a surprise in dealing with the record of a people of remote significance to international affairs, whose primary concerns were with their own local identity and destiny under Yahweh Jehovah. Yet this destiny was set firmly within a context governed by the recognition that their national God was also the universal creator. The mantle of the creator God, as conceived throughout the ancient Near East, fell locally upon Yahweh. The Hebrews shared an understanding of the world with their neighbors, which took for granted that universal order was the gift of God and the great miracle of the universe. It was an insight upon which all religion, ethics, and knowledge was founded. It was the air which the ancient Near East breathed, and the point is made by the German theologian Klaus Westermann. Creation was not an article of faith because there was simply no alternative. In other words, the Old Testament had a different understanding of reality from ours, inasmuch as there was no other reality than that established by God. They had no need to expressly believe that the world was created by God, because that was a presupposition of their thinking. In other words, whatever the local horizon, humans knew themselves as part of something much bigger and more complex. It is the will of the same God who established the local that has been responsible for the whole and given it purpose. And that whole is made up of many different landscapes, societies, languages, and religious practices. God's intention cannot be understood apart from that comprehensive overview. And that perspective, I think, is captured, for instance, by the prophet Amos. Did I not bring up Israel from the land of Egypt, the Philistines from Caphtor, and the Arameans from Kir? Israel shared and did not invent this general insight which acknowledged the world as a creation. There was, therefore, always an awareness that brought a universal context to the activity of God. The fact that this was a shared perspective with her neighbors and the cultural environment that stretched from Mesopotamia to Egypt meant for Israel that not only was the content of the creation message universal, but also its form. It arose from an international context which bestowed a validity on the claim that God is the universal creator. There was an insight for which message and messenger were one. Israel's greater context enabled her to reflect on the universal creator as a theological given. We may perhaps push the significance of the particular context and time in history which Israel emerged. As far as we can gauge, the combustion of civilization first took place in the final quarter of the 3rd millennium BCE in the ancient Near East. Sumer seems to have had the edge, hotly pursued by ancient Egypt. It is in these places that we first recognize human capacity enabled by the invention of writing to blossom into complex society with city life, crafts, culture, literature, law, and develop religious reflections and practice. It is a World Heritage moment, and it is that World Heritage moment, with its first sophisticated reflection on humans within their environment, which feeds the biblical understanding of creation. Dare I say, even in Rome, that the Hebrew scriptures leapfrog the classics, and their context within the ancient Near East enables a conduit to humanity's primeval youth that brings to their universalism a particular richness and validity. Further light on the nature of universalism of the biblical creation traditions becomes evident if we focus on what is known as the primeval history, that is Genesis 1 to 11, the opening chapters of the Hebrew Bible. And here, slide 7 would help me. Here is the illustrated first letter of the Bible as found from the Winchester Bible. It is the I of the Latin in principio, in principle, God created the heaven and the earth in the beginning. And the ornate first letter of Genesis opens those magnificent first 11 chapters of Genesis, which include the creation accounts, the flood narrative, and conclude with the episode of the Tower of Babel. Firstly, we must note with Klaus Westermann that the context of the issues raised in the primeval narrative has to be seen in a universal human context, which rises above the cultural and geographical confines even of the ancient Near East. Here are insights that arise spontaneously over different cultures, continents, and epochs. They are quite simply universal archetypal human concerns. And Westermann says, the reflection on creator creation took place in the context of primeval myths. It was the reflection of threatened man in a threatened world. The creation myths then had the function of preserving the world and giving security to life. Stefan Pass more recently has further clarified Westermann's insight. Therefore, the biblical creation stories have a previous history in the traditions of humankind. They did not appear out of the blue, but are rooted in what families, generations, and nations have handed down since time immemorial. If we can move on to slide 8, which picks up just one of those roundels. The flood story here illustrated from that initial at the beginning of Genesis can be identified as one of those archetypal narratives that articulates a common human journey. The hero of the biblical flood narrative is Noah. In the 17th century BCE Mesopotamian version, his name is Atrahasis. The saga of the animals taken into the ark to rescue them from the rising flood is a favorite even of the modern nursery. Westermann argues that the story of a flood spontaneously springs up in different and unrelated cultures as able vividly to articulate threatened man in a threatened world. It is universal coinage, as the billboards across Rome for the latest blockbuster version witness. And I've been intrigued that wherever I go in Rome, I can't get away from the flood from Noah. We may further note a remarkable characteristic of the universalism of the primeval history in Genesis 1 to 11. It does seem that primeval narrative represents a particular literary form that operated within its own strict parameters. Genesis 1 to 11 shares with a class of biblical literature known as the wisdom tradition a significant integrity. The context of primeval history enables the narrative to reflect in a disciplined and scientific way upon a world that is utterly relativized and where there is no place on the globe that has precedence over another. In contrast to the Jerusalem traditions, in Genesis 1 to 11, there is no navel of the universe. According to those chapters of Genesis, all cultures, all languages, all races, the whole diversity of humanity are equidistant from God. There can be no special pleading, no favoring of particular place or circumstances, in a way that is quite remarkable in its context and challenging to those who encounter it. The primeval history that stands at the head of the book of Genesis reflects on human beings in their context in almost laboratory conditions. It's able to hold up to scrutiny in a coolly analytical way a human couple, brothers, a whole generation, and humanity in highly organized society. It is able to portray human potential for civilized life and the development of crafts and skills, while at the same time portraying contingency, creatureliness, and shadow as equally universally true. Genesis 1 to 11 affords remarkably scrupulous observation of the human condition without any labels relating to race, religion, or nationality. The significance of those chapters as the preface to all that follows in the Hebrew scriptures cannot be overemphasized. Those chapters are a jewel of great price. They set a context under which the whole of the rest of the Bible sits, the Hebrew scriptures, the Old and New Testament for Christians. They are cleansing of all tribalism, parochialism, and special interests that are smuggled into religious practice. And I would go as far as to say that religion without this proper sense of the Creator is dangerous, as it bestows absolutes without a corrective. The Hebrew scriptures open with a magisterial vision of creation that takes its bearings from God alone. It gives no warrant to sectarianism, racism, or any other grounds for local superiority. Contemplation on the quality of universalism in the Hebrew scriptures in general, and the primeval traditions in particular, can do nothing less than be transformative. My last slide, I think, just humans in reflection. It leads to the conclusion articulated by the former chief rabbi of the Commonwealth, Jonathan Sacks, who says, to have faith in God as creator and ruler of the universe is to do more than to believe that God has spoken to us. It is to believe that God has spoken to others in a language which we may not understand. Let me just repeat that Rabbi Sacks' gold quotation. To have faith in God as creator and ruler of the universe is to do more than to believe that God has spoken to us. It is to believe that God has spoken to others in a language which we may not understand. And that, I submit, is where interfaith dialogue and mutual respect must begin.